So I wanted to jump on here and do, I guess, a vlog. Haven't done one in a while. I do not have the fancy car filter with me today, but instead I'm just going to talk here from my office with my many leather-bound books in the background and just sort of talk off the cuff a little bit about Pope Francis, his death, I think what it portends. Nothing too mean-spirited or anything like that. I've been on record in many podcasts saying that I think that Pope Francis was not a good pope. But I'm not really talking about that today. I want to talk sort of about the background and what he has sat upon in terms of the sort of the legacy and where it stands, and maybe some quick projections here just off the cuff. Like I said, I woke up this morning. I woke up. I always wake up a little bit before 5 o'clock. I go downstairs, I make my coffee, and I pick up my phone, and I had a message in my email from the Pillar podcast or the Pillar Substack, JD Flynn and Ed Condon, announcing the Pope had in fact died. Did a little quick check just to make sure, because sometimes these media releases happen inadvertently because the Pope has been sick for quite a bit. And so I know that almost all of the media organizations and outlets have some kind of something ready to go. They can always add a paragraph at the end, just in case something happens at the tail end. At any rate, it was true. And so over my coffee, I sent a couple of texts to friends, and hopefully I didn't wake them up. I wasn't intending to wake them up, but anyway, and so there it is. And I have been thinking all day today about this being, an end of an era in many respects. I have long thought that his papacy represented a kind of last, and again, this is all speculative on my part, so take it for what it's worth. But and maybe this is me wishfully thinking. Who knows? Maybe I'll be totally wrong in 3 weeks when we've got a new guy. But the kind of church that he sat upon. He talked about synodality all the time. He talked about a welcoming church, and of course, if you listen to reports on CNN and reports on CBS and all the mainstream outlets, he is going to be lauded, I'm pretty sure, as a pope that the media loved, much more so than perhaps a lot of the members of his own church. And so that's interesting. I think that's worth ruminating on, why that would be. But he did a couple of spectacular gestures in the opening of his papacy, taking public transportation, to the conclave and refusing to live in the papal apartments, instead living in Casa Santa Marta, I think it's called. Eschewing the red shoes of the traditional red shoes that his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, had worn as sort of precious and outmoded. And so he did a lot of these kind of gestures that immediately caught the attention of the right people. And his sort of vision, as a sort of Jesuit, as a South American, as the first non-European, he was a lot of firsts. But as I think over, his legacy, he very much made sort of the traditional elements of the church and the traditional faithful, especially the Latin Mass folks, many of whom I count as friends and family. He did not like them very much. In fact, went out of his way oftentimes to antagonize them and call them backwardists and indeed true. He had all these phrases, so I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. So like I said, since I'm riffing right now, and very much was much less precise, let's say, than his predecessor. But this papacy stands right in the middle of all of the arguments that were generated and made in the council, the Second Vatican Council, which I think officially ended in 1965, sort of in 65, 64, and 63, with preparation in 62, if my numbers add up. But so you're sitting there thinking, okay, Kale, it's 2025. I mean, like, why the heck are we still talking about this thing? Well, you have to understand that, the church is sort of old. It understands time in a different sort of way. And but the papacy. So Paul VI is the pope that sort of, it was started by John the 23rd, but he dies, and Paul VI sort of takes over and makes sure that the council kind of finishes its work, and then promulgates the documents in throughout 1965. And why are we still talking about this? You might be wondering. Well, the councils are kind of a big deal, and it oftentimes takes a little bit of time for it to sort of settle in to sort of what it's going to be. Most of, if not all of the various councils were called in a response to some sort of crisis. The crisis, I guess, that the Second Vatican Council was called in response to was not necessarily a heresy per se. It wasn't about the Protestant Reformation, or it wasn't about, the various issues in the creed. It was something called a kind of pastoral council. So, like, how to be a church in the modern world is sort of one way you can kind of think of this. And again, the point of this vlog is not to sort of be hyper specific about things, but just sort of talk about things in general and how it is received popularly. So my mother was a freshman in college at a Catholic college in the South when the council was begun, and she has talked to me about it, and I talked to a lot of my other friends who are that age, that there's just this great spirit of optimism that, oh, finally, things were kind of updating and modern. We have a Catholic president now, right? So we Catholics can kind of do anything. And so it was a period of high optimism and high ascendancy for Catholics in the United States of America. And so when the news was sort of coming out of from the council, the thought was that, well, everything gets to be new, just like we have a kind of new country, we have a kind of new Catholic president. He's handsome. We're going to have a new church too, right? And so it's sort of all kind of caught up in this optimism. Now, of course, this is an American take, but there are European takes, and there are global takes on all of this. I'm just sort of talking about it from the American frame because I think that's has been dominant in terms of the media paradigm. And the documents themselves were certainly new. There were some new things that were staked out, but the documents, I think, a fairly coherent theological justification can be made for all of them. And I know that some of my traditional friends are going to carp about X, Y, or Z, some of the documents in the Second Vatican Council. But I think all things being equal, they're theologically sound. But the big change, of course, when everybody thinks of Vatican II, like, what are they really talking about? In my way of thinking, I think the biggest change, right, the thing that really rocked everyone's world, was the fact of the changes in the practices of the faithful. You remember, up until 1967 or 68, depending upon where you were, the Mass was in Latin. The priest faced ad orientem, that is, the priest was facing the altar, and the congregation was kind of lined up behind the priest, and they were all kind of looking toward the altar and up through the crucifix, and theoretically, as it goes up to the heavens, right? And so you see many people had like prayer books and had the Latin on the left side and the English translation on the right hand side, and so it was a fairly sort of odd and otherworldly experience. Certainly radically different than any of their Protestant friends and neighbors. Their experience of church, of course, had always been in the vernacular. The Catholics always had this sort of strange Latin distinctive. Well, that was gotten away with, and then about a year and a half to 2.5 years later, a whole new Mass was promulgated. And part of what was sold to the faithful was that, well, we're doing new things. We're not doing these old things anymore. We have a kind of a new expression of the faith, right? And so for most people, they trusted the priests, they trusted the nuns, they trusted the teachers that were sort of inviting them into this new expression. There were certainly a small and loud and cranky, you might say, trad holdout, but they were really, in the grand scheme of things, pretty irrelevant in terms of it. In other words, the faithful were open to what the leaders of the church were promoting and selling, and so they went along with it. Now, interestingly, the interpretation of the council was very much up for grabs amongst the theologians, amongst the preti, amongst the specialists, amongst the bishops and cardinals, and even the popes, right? And so when Paul VI promulgated the new mass, this was supposed to be something that came out of the council. And that in and of itself, of course, is a whole controversy. I'm not going to bore you with those details because I'm not an expert. I really just kind of want to talk about the phenomena of the thing. So I think of in this case, I think of my mother. She grew up in the pre-conciliar church, and her entire experience of the liturgy was in Latin, a much more formal, high smells and bells, type experience. And so, as a young woman in college, you would imagine that this was sort of these changes were really exciting, but everything changed. Everything changed uh, in terms of the practical, participatory aspects of the faith. And so there was lots of confusion then. Well, what about this issue? And what about that issue? Well, everything's changing, and don't worry about that. And soon this is going to change. Birth control is going to change, and this is going to change, and just like the mask got changed, all these other things are going to get changed. And so there's really kind of a sense of like, well, what's going on? And so immediately, sort of these camps. I think it's the concilium camp and the communio camp kind of rise up to sort of say, well, who owns the interpretation of this council? And the communio group was people that what I would say are sort of roughly a little bit more conservative, and the concilium group were much more radically or progressively inclined. And so that sort of became the fight. And so Paul VI, I think, in the end, whatever, he's sort of like an institutionalist. John Paul II comes in after a 28-day John Paul I. John Paul II emerges as the outsider candidate, and he very much is part of the Communio school, as was Benedict XVI. Now, though Jorge Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis, was not formally part of any of these theological camps. All of the people who sort of lined themselves up in the concilium camp were very excited about what Francis was bringing to the church. And so, so much of what happened there is a fight over the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And that fight was real. It kind of got ugly. It was pretty disturbing, all things said. So then my question, and I'm going to end it here because I don't want to do too much on this and kind of marking this for the historical record. But my question is, what is going to happen next? Is the official post-conciliar era over now, or or do we have another part of this new church? Another pope that will sort of promote this. I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen. I think the assessment of the council has to be done in a much more sober and thorough way. I think that all too often we get caught up in what are ostensibly theological fights, but I don't think that that's what the Second Vatican Council became in terms of the phenomena. I think that that much more consequential was how the church was promoted in the pews rather than how the church was fought over in the colleges of and faculties of theology. Naturally, theology has implications for all of these matters, and so I'm not trying to say this as a way to skirt theological questions, but for the rank and file person, Vatican II meant that everything changed. And the primary mechanism, or that was conveyed to the people, was simple. The Mass, which used to be formal and vertical and Latin, became horizontal, um, and flat and mostly banal. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't beautiful expressions of the Novus Ordo. I go to one, but in the end, what was delivered to the people were not documents per se. The nerds love documents, but people go to church or stop going to church, as the case became. But that's where they learn. Right? That's what this was ultimately about. And what I have never understood about the Pope Francis wing of the church is the reform of the reform of the reform. It keeps going back and forth. You know, if they had their way, will that really lead to this so-called springtime, this new evangelization? Will it really work that if we could just sort of soften this or that, if we could just do the Novus Ordo harder, that people will some sort of magically start returning to church? And I just find that just not true, not compelling. I think naive at best. And so then what are they doing? And naturally, a lot of this is coming for me in the aftermath of what just happened in Detroit and the further suppression of the traditional Latin Mass. I don't know what's going to happen with all these liturgy wars, but I do know that churchmen that have cut their teeth in the sort of the Novus Ordo world, sort of the Pope Francis Church, and in certain respects, is the JP2 and Benedict XVI Church, they're not going to kind of let go nicely. So it'll depend, I think, in how much of the mess do the cardinals have a stomach for in the next few years? Is there going to be a desire to sort of transition to something new? Is there going to be a sort of a reactionary pope? I don't know. Um, I don't know. But I do know that the world, the young people in particular, Gen Z in particular, are longing for something strange and mystical and metaphysical. And um, what they get at the local parish is none of those things. And yet we have this great tradition of all of those things. And so, as I see people attracted to the divine liturgy of the Orthodox, I get it. I know why young people are attracted to those things, because it doesn't look normal. It doesn't look like school. It doesn't look like anything else. It looks like it actually takes itself seriously. And so, my prayer is that the next pope will, I don't know, maybe make the church weird again. Yeah, that's sort of it. Make the church weird again. All right. Well, that's my documenting the historical record of the death of Pope Francis. May he rest in peace. We should pray for him, and let's pray for the church. Let's pray for the church, that the successor knows what time it is. Cheers. God bless.